Lena Ward hit the ground so hard her teeth cracked together and the taste of copper flooded her mouth. 400 wolves watched. Not one of them moved. She pushed herself up from the ceremonial marble, her palms slick with her own blood from where her claws had punched through the skin without her permission. The bond scar on her collarbone burned like someone had pressed a lit cigarette into it, and she could feel every pair of eyes in the great hall crawling over her like ants on something they were deciding whether to eat. Dominic Hale stood on the dais above her. Her mate, the man the universe had chosen for her out of every living wolf on the planet, the one whose heartbeat she had felt sync with hers 3 weeks ago, in a moment so pure she had dropped a pot of coffee and started laughing like an idiot in the middle of a diner. The bond had clicked into place like a key turning in a lock she did not even know she carried, and for the first time in 23 years of being nobody from nowhere, Lena had believed something good was actually going to stick. Dominic's hand was on another woman's waist. Vanessa Grant, blonde, rich in the way that made other people's money look like pocket lint. Her father owned the land the Blackmere Pack lived on, the mines beneath it, and half the territory between here and the coast. She wore white to the Luna selection ceremony, which was either bold or prophetic, and she looked at Lena with the kind of pity that people reserve for stray animals they are not going to take home. Dominic did not look at Lena at all. He had looked at her once, when the ceremony began. She had felt his recognition, the bond pulling taut between them like a wire in the chest, and then something behind his eyes had closed, the way a shopkeeper closes a register. Transaction over. Thanks for stopping by. He chose Vanessa. He said the words into the ceremonial mic, his voice steady and practiced, and completely empty of anything that resembled shame. He talked about the future of the pack, strategic alliances, financial stability. The Blackmere Wolves needed resources, needed territory, needed the kind of security that came with the Grant family name. He talked about duty and sacrifice and the hard choices that leaders make. He never said Lena's name. The crowd did not gasp. They did not murmur or shift uncomfortably. That was the worst part. 400 wolves heard their future alpha publicly sever a mate bond, and they just stood there, because Lena was the orphaned daughter of a disgraced Omega, and nobody in that room had ever expected the universe to be stupid enough to bond her to someone who mattered. The universe had been stupid. Dominic was correcting the error. Lena stood up. Her knees almost buckled because the severed bond was doing something to her nervous system that felt like being electrocuted in slow motion. But she locked her legs and forced her spine straight and walked down the center aisle of the great hall with her chin up and her bloody palms leaving prints on her dress. She did not cry. She would not give them that. Every person in this room had spent 23 years treating her like a charity case, like something to be tolerated, like the unfortunate consequence of parents who had made bad choices and then had the poor taste to die before anyone could properly punish them. She had spent her whole life proving she was more than the whispered poor thing that followed her down every hallway. She would not cry in front of them. She made it to the parking lot before her legs gave out. The gravel bit into her knees. The bond scar pulsed with a heat that bordered on unbearable, and she pressed her forehead against the cold metal of a stranger's truck bumper and breathed through it the way she breathed through everything. 1 count in, 2 counts out. Repeat until the world decides to stop punishing you or you stop caring which one comes first. She did not know how long she stayed there. Long enough for the ceremony to end inside, for the sound of clapping and laughter to drift through the hall doors and settle over her like dirt on a coffin. They were celebrating. Vanessa Grant was the new Luna of Blackmere, and the pack was pleased, and somewhere in that hall Dominic Hale was smiling and shaking hands and pretending that the woman kneeling in the parking lot with gravel embedded in her knees did not exist. She drove. She did not pack a bag. She did not leave a note. She got in her car, a 14-year-old sedan that smelled like coffee and had a crack running across the windshield like a river on a map, and she drove until Blackmere territory was a smudge in the rearview mirror and the road ahead was empty and dark and pointed nowhere in particular. The bond scar screamed for the first 100 miles. It felt like someone had hooked a chain to her collarbone and attached the other end to the dais, where Dominic stood, and every mile she drove stretched it tighter. She could feel him. That was the cruelty of it. Even severed, the bond left echoes. She could feel his heartbeat, distant and steady, completely unbothered by the fact that she was falling apart at 70 miles an hour on a 2-lane highway with no headlights coming from the other direction. He was fine. She was dissolving. She stopped at a gas station at the border of unclaimed territory, the kind of place where the lights buzzed and the bathroom key was chained to a hubcap, and the clerk behind the counter had the dead eyes of someone who had been asking themselves the same question for 40 years and still did not have an answer. Lena bought a bottle of water and a packet of aspirin that would do absolutely nothing for a severed mate bond, but gave her hands something to do. She sat on the hood of her car and stared at the sky and tried to figure out what came next when everything you had been holding on to turned out to be a door that was never going to open. She noticed the black SUV because it did not belong here. It was parked on the other side of the pumps, sleek and dark, and expensive in a way that made the rest of the gas station look like it was apologizing for existing. A man leaned against the driver's side door with his arms crossed, watching her. Not staring. Watching. The way someone watches a chess piece they have been waiting for the other player to move. He was tall, dark hair cut short, a face that looked like it had been assembled by someone who understood geometry but had no interest in making things pretty. Everything about him was sharp, jaw, cheekbones, the way his eyes tracked her movements with the kind of calm, focused attention that predators use when they have already decided they are faster than you and there is no reason to rush. Lena's wolf stirred for the first time since the ceremony, not the frantic, clawing panic of the severed bond. Something else, something quieter, recognition without context. The man nodded at her once, like they had met before. They had not. Lena did not nod back. She got in her car and drove away and watched him shrink in the rearview mirror until the darkness swallowed the SUV and the gas station and the border of everything she had ever known. She slept in a parking lot that night, a big box store on the outskirts of a town she had never heard of, surrounded by shopping carts and pickup trucks and the distant hum of a highway overpass that never stopped vibrating. She curled up in the back seat with her jacket balled under her head and the bond scar pulsing like a second heartbeat, and she tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes she saw Dominic's hand on Vanessa's waist, the way his fingers spread across the white fabric of her dress like he was claiming territory. The pack would come looking for her. She knew this the way she knew her own name, with the dull certainty of someone who has lived in a system long enough to understand its machinery. Rejected mates who fled were categorized as unstable, dangerous. There were protocols, retrieval teams, quiet conversations about containment and risk management, and the safety of the pack that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with control. She had maybe 48 hours before they sent someone. She did not have a plan. She did not have money, beyond the $300 in her checking account and the change rattling in her cup holder. She did not have family, or friends outside Blackmere, or anywhere to go that was not just another version of the parking lot she was sitting in now. She had herself. It had never been enough before. She did not know why it would be enough now. But it was all she had, so she held on to it the way she held on to everything, with both hands and her teeth and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to let go that was the only inheritance her parents had ever left her. She woke up to a tap on her window. The man from the gas station stood outside her car in the gray light of 6 in the morning, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He was wearing different clothes than last night, simple, dark. They fit him the way expensive things fit people who do not think about money because they have never had to. Lena's hand went to the door lock. Her wolf pressed forward behind her ribs, not in warning, but in that same strange, contextless recognition. The man held up one of the coffees like a peace offering. She stared at him through the glass. He waited. He did not look impatient. He did not look threatening. He looked like someone who had all the time in the world and had chosen to spend it standing in a parking lot at dawn, holding coffee for a woman he did not know, as if this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Lena cracked the window 2 inches. The smell of the coffee hit her, and it was good coffee, the kind that came from actual beans, and not from the machine inside the store that dispensed brown liquid with the enthusiasm of a broken faucet. She said, "Who are you?" and her voice came out wrecked, scraped raw from the crying she had done alone in the dark when there was no one to perform strength for. He said his name was Cale, just Cale. No pack name attached, no family title, no territory marker, just a first name, offered simply, like it was all she needed. She told him where he could put his coffee. He almost smiled. He put the second cup on the roof of her car and walked back to his SUV and drove away. Lena sat in the back seat and watched him leave and told herself she was not going to drink the coffee. She drank the coffee. It was the best thing she had tasted in 48 hours, which was not saying much because the only other thing she had consumed was gas station aspirin and a granola bar from her glove compartment that may have been older than her car. She found his card tucked under her windshield wiper when she got out to throw the cup away. Plain white, black text, a phone number, nothing else. No name, no title, no explanation. Just a number and the unspoken suggestion that she might need it. She shoved the card in her pocket and drove another 60 miles before the bond scar hit her so hard she had to pull over on the shoulder and press her face against the steering wheel until she could breathe again. 48 hours, she told herself. 48 hours before the retrieval team. 48 hours before Blackmere reached out with its long fingers and pulled her back into the machine. She pulled the card out of her pocket. She stared at the number. She called. He picked up on the second ring, as if he had been holding the phone. Lena sat in a diner booth 40 miles past the Blackmere border, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not ordered, and her eyes locked on the man across the table, who had somehow arrived before her. She had called him from the highway shoulder 20 minutes ago. She had driven here. He was already sitting in the booth when she walked in, a menu open in front of him, reading it with the casual attention of someone who ate in highway diners every day of his life. He did not. She could tell this the way she could tell the difference between real leather and fake. Everything about Cale was expensive. Not loud expensive. Not gold watch and sports car expensive. The quiet kind. The kind where the fabric sits right, and the shoes are handmade, and the watch is a brand you have never heard of because you are not supposed to hear of it. The kind of expensive that does not need you to notice. He ordered eggs. She ordered nothing. He pushed a plate of toast toward her anyway. She ate the toast because she had not eaten real food in 2 days, and pride is a luxury that runs out faster than money. "What do you want?" she said. He told her. "A contract marriage. Simple. Legal. Temporary." Lena laughed. It came out sharp and broken and slightly wild, and the waitress behind the counter looked over with the cautious concern of someone who has seen things go sideways in diners before and knows which booth to avoid. Cale waited for the laugh to finish. He did not look offended. He looked like he had expected this exact reaction and had already calculated how long it would take to burn through. He laid it out without drama. He needed a wife. The reasons were complicated, and he did not explain them, and when she asked why, he deflected with the smoothness of someone who had been deflecting questions from people much scarier than her for a very long time. She would get protection, legitimate territory rights, a name that would put a wall between her and any retrieval team Blackmere sent. In exchange, she would play the role for a year, and when the year was up, she could walk away with enough resources to build whatever life she wanted. "No," Lena said. She said it firmly. She said it with her jaw set and her eyes steady and every ounce of dignity she could scrape together after 2 days of sleeping in parking lots and crying in the dark. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not push. He put cash on the table for the food she had not ordered and stood up and said the offer would hold if she changed her mind. He left the card again. Same number. Same plain white card with no name. She watched him walk out of the diner and get into the black SUV and pull away like a shadow retracting into a corner. That night she slept in her car again, this time in a campground parking lot where the trees pressed close enough to make the darkness feel solid. The Bond scar woke her at 2 in the morning, a spike of pain so sharp she bit through her own lip and tasted blood for the second time in 3 days. She lay in the back seat and stared at the ceiling of her car and did the math. $300, a quarter tank of gas, no job, no territory, no pack, no family, a severed mate bond that was eating her alive from the collarbone out, and somewhere behind her, a retrieval team assembling in the Blackmere packhouse, pulling her file, plotting her route, calculating how long it would take to find a girl with no friends, no resources, and no reason for anyone to hide her. She called the number at 5 in the morning. He picked up on the first ring this time. The wedding was in a courthouse, in a town that existed only on paper. Population 900, 1 traffic light, a main street with a hardware store, a church, and a bar, and nothing else for 20 miles in any direction. The officiant was human, and smelled like peppermint and old books, and had the cheerful indifference of someone who had married strangers before, and would marry strangers again, and did not consider it any of his business why. Cale wore a dark suit that fit him the way dark suits fit men who have worn them every day of their lives. Lena wore the same dress she had fled Blackmere in, wrinkled and stained and smelling faintly of gas station coffee and parking lot gravel. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Cale signed his name with a pen that looked like it cost more than every piece of clothing Lena had ever owned combined. She signed hers with a ballpoint she borrowed from the clerk, and her hand shook only once, and she covered it by pretending to adjust her grip. Done. Married. She stood on the courthouse steps in the thin sunlight of a nothing town in the middle of nowhere and felt absolutely nothing, which was either shock or relief, or the emotional equivalent of a computer crashing and needing to restart. Cale stood beside her and did not touch her, and did not speak, and did not seem to require anything from her beyond the fact that she had shown up. She appreciated that more than she would ever tell him. They drove separately. He led, she followed, and the road went north and then west and then climbed into mountains she had never seen before, where the trees grew thick and dark and the air thinned until her ears popped, and the world below disappeared behind a curtain of cloud and granite. The compound appeared out of the forest like a hallucination. Stone walls, tall, old, the kind of old that meant someone had been building here before maps existed. Guard towers at the corners, manned by wolves she could sense before she could see, their presence radiating outward like heat from a furnace. A gate made of iron and something else, something that smelled like age and authority, and the kind of power that does not announce itself because it does not have to. Cale stopped his SUV at the gate, and a guard approached and looked at Lena's car behind him, and then looked at Cale, and then opened the gate without asking a single question. The compound stretched beyond the wall in every direction, buildings, training grounds, a structure at the center that rose above everything else, built from dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Part cathedral, part fortress, part something she did not have a word for. Wolves everywhere, moving in pairs and groups, crossing courtyards and entering buildings with the purposeful stride of people who had somewhere important to be. These were not pack wolves. Pack wolves moved with the easy, territorial looseness of dogs in their own yard. These wolves moved like soldiers, like weapons that had learned to walk upright and wear clothing. Lena's wolf pressed against her ribs and whined. "Where am I?" she said. Cale turned to her, and for the first time since the gas station, something in his face shifted. Not softness, not warmth. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who was about to drop a very heavy piece of information and was curious how the floor would hold. "This is the Lycan court," he said. Lena knew what the Lycan court was, the way everyone knew what the Lycan court was. The way children know about the ocean before they ever see it. A vast, distant, impossibly powerful thing that existed somewhere out there, governing the world of wolves from a height so far above ordinary packs that most wolves lived their entire lives without ever meeting anyone who had been inside it. The Lycan court was the shadow government, the final authority, the place where pack alphas went when they needed permission, or forgiveness, or to beg. Every pack in the country answered to the Lycan court. And the Lycan court answered to one person, the Lycan king. Lena looked at Kale. Kale looked back. No, she said. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in that same calm, unhurried expression, and he waited for her to do the math herself. The expensive clothes, the guards who did not question him, the SUV that appeared and disappeared like it had its own weather system, the way he carried himself, not with arrogance, but with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had never in his life needed to prove anything to anyone because the proof was the ground beneath his feet, and it belonged to him. She had married the Lycan king in a courthouse in a nothing town with a borrowed pen. "You could have told me," she said, and her voice was flat because she had used up all her emotional range in the last 3 days, and there was nothing left for this particular revelation except the dull acknowledgement that the universe was apparently not finished making her life ridiculous. Kale said, "Would it have changed your answer?" She thought about it. No, it would not have changed her answer because her answer had not been about him. It had been about survival. About the retrieval team and the empty gas tank and the bond scar eating through her collarbone and the simple, terrible arithmetic of a woman with no options choosing the only door that was open. She had not married the Lycan king. She had married a stranger who offered her a wall between herself and the people who wanted to drag her back. The fact that the wall turned out to be the most powerful wolf alive was just the universe's idea of a joke. A cruel one, or a kind one. She could not tell yet. He showed her to a room in the east wing of the central building. It was larger than the apartment she had grown up in, a bed that could sleep 4, windows that looked out over the mountains, a bathroom with a door that locked. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the bed and the windows and the mountains and felt like a trespasser in someone else's dream. Kale stood in the doorway and told her that dinner was at 7 and attendance was optional and that no one would bother her unless she wanted to be bothered. He left. She sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for the punchline. It did not come. Instead, the bond scar pulsed once, hard, and then went quiet for the first time in 3 days. Not gone, just quiet, like something had placed a hand over it and whispered hush. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke up, there was food on the table by the window, not cafeteria food, not pack house leftovers, a plate of eggs and toast and fruit, and a cup of coffee that smelled exactly like the coffee Kale had brought her at the parking lot, the good kind, the kind that came from actual beans and not from a machine. She ate all of it. She showered until the hot water ran out, and then stood in the cold water, because it felt like something, and feeling something was better than the numb static that had been filling her head since the ceremony. She dressed in her own clothes, the only ones she had, and went looking for answers. The compound was bigger than she had understood. Corridors stretched in every direction, lined with stone, and lit by fixtures that looked old but burned with modern light. Wolves passed her in the hallways and their eyes landed on the bond scar visible above her collar, and stayed there a beat too long before sliding away. She could feel them cataloging her. Orphan, Omega bloodline, rejected mate, wearing 3-day-old clothes in a place where everyone else looked like they had been polished before breakfast. The whispers started before lunch. She heard them the way you hear music from a passing car, fragments, not meant for her ears, but not trying very hard to avoid them either. The Lycan king married a rejected mate, an Omega's daughter on the obsidian throne. She has a bond scar, a visible one. She was thrown away. Lena stopped in the middle of a corridor and pressed her thumbnail into her palm until the half-moon dent turned white. She had been here before. Different building, different wolves, same math. You are less than. You are a mistake someone made. You are the thing that does not belong in the room. She had survived it at Blackmere for 23 years. She would survive it here. She found the dining hall by following the noise and the smell, and she walked in with her chin up and her shoulders back and her 3-day-old dress wrinkled in all the wrong places, and she sat at an empty table and ate dinner alone while 100 wolves watched her and decided what she was worth. Kale was not at dinner. She did not look for him. She did not need to look for him, because she did not need him. And the sooner everyone in this polished stone compound understood that Lena Ward did not need anyone, the sooner they would stop expecting her to collapse. She finished her food, she washed her plate, she walked back to her room. On the nightstand, someone had placed a small glass jar of dried herbs. She recognized the scent immediately. It was a Bon Salve compound, rare and difficult to source, the kind of thing that eased the pain of a severed mate bond from a scream to a murmur. No note. She did not need a note to know who had left it. She pressed the jar against her collarbone and breathed in the scent and felt the scar go quiet, and she sat on the bed in the too big room in the too big compound and told herself that she was not going to cry. She cried. Not for Dominic. Not for the bond. Not for Blackmere or the ceremony or the 400 wolves who had watched her hit the ground and done nothing. She cried because someone had remembered that she was in pain and had done something about it without asking for credit, and she could not remember the last time that had happened. She fell asleep with the jar in her hand and the mountains outside her window turning black under a sky full of stars she had never seen from this altitude, and for the first time in 3 days, the bond scar let her sleep through the night. The first attack came on her 4th day at the Lycan court, and it was dressed up so well that she almost missed it. A training session, mandatory for all new residents, the guard captain said, with the polished smile of someone delivering a lie that had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Standard orientation. Nothing to worry about. The training courtyard was a stone arena carved into the side of the mountain, ringed by tiered seating where wolves gathered to watch like it was entertainment. And maybe it was. The rejected Omega who married the king tossed into a sparring ring with wolves who had been training since they could walk. A spectacle. A test. A message. Her opponent was a female wolf named Petra, who was 6 inches taller than Lena and moved with the oiled confidence of someone who had never lost a fight and did not intend to start today. She wore training leathers that fit like armor and carried herself the way warriors carry themselves in stories, with that particular combination of grace and violence that makes you understand why people used to worship wolves. Lena wore borrowed sweats that were 2 sizes too big and sneakers she had been wearing for 4 days straight. The sparring was supposed to be controlled, light contact, orientation level. Petra's first strike opened a gash across Lena's ribs that went through the sweatshirt and into the skin beneath it. Lena hit the ground. Again, stone under her palms, blood on her shirt, and the sound of the crowd shifting in their seats. Not gasping, not protesting, shifting, the way an audience shifts when the play is going exactly as they expected. She got up. Petra hit her again, shoulder this time, then hip, each strike precise and technical and carrying exactly enough force to hurt without leaving the kind of damage that would require an official inquiry. This was not training, this was a demonstration. Look at the Omega. Look at what she cannot do. Look at where she does not belong. Lena's wolf was snarling behind her ribs, pressing forward with a fury that tasted like metal, but Lena held her back because she knew the math. If she shifted, if she fought back with everything she had, she would either lose and prove them right, or win and become a threat they would escalate against. She stayed on her feet. She took the hits. She did not go down again. Petra got frustrated. Lena could see it in the way her movements sharpened, lost their performance quality, became real. She wanted Lena on the ground. She wanted the visual, the Omega, flat on her back, proving to the entire court that Kale had made a mistake. Lena did not give it to her. She took every hit and stayed standing, and stared at Petra with eyes that said, "You can keep going. I have been hurt by better than you, and this is not even in my top 5 worst days this week. The session ended without a winner because you cannot win a fight when the other person refuses to fall. Lena walked off the training ground with claw marks on her ribs and bruises forming across her shoulders and the borrowed sweatshirt torn at the collar. The crowd watched her go. She did not look at them. She made it to the corridor outside the east wing before her legs gave out. She sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall and pressed her hand against the gash on her ribs and focused on the pain, because pain was simple and straightforward and did not require her to figure out the politics of a place she did not understand. Footsteps. She expected a guard, a medic maybe. It was Marcus. She did not know him yet, but she would come to know him well. Cale's right hand, a wolf built like a wardrobe with a face that looked like someone had carved it from a cliff and then decided the cliff was prettier. He had scars on his forearms and a voice that sounded like gravel being polished, and he looked at Lena sitting on the floor, bleeding through a borrowed sweatshirt, with an expression she could not immediately classify. He sat down next to her on the stone floor and said nothing. After a while he said, "Petra is the niece of Lord Harlan." Lena said, "I don't know who Lord Harlan is." Marcus said, "Lord Harlan has been positioning his daughter for the Queen's seat for 6 years. You are currently sitting in his daughter's future." Lena looked at the blood on her hand. She said, "His daughter can have the seat. I don't want a seat. I want to not be bleeding on this floor." Marcus almost smiled. It was the kind of smile that happened in the eyes rather than the mouth, and it lasted about half a second before his face rearranged itself back into stone. He said, "The king knows about the sparring session." Lena said, "Good for the king." Marcus said, "Petra's assignment has been changed. She reports to the northern border outpost tomorrow morning. It is very cold at the northern border outpost." Lena looked at him. He looked back. She understood then, in the way you understand the rules of a game by watching other people play it. Cale did not fight her battles for her. He did not intervene in the arena, or stop the sparring, or stride across the courtyard in a dramatic display of royal authority. He let it happen. He let her take the hits and stay on her feet and prove whatever she needed to prove. And then, after, quietly, without announcement or spectacle, he removed the threat. Not for her, for the principle. You do not attack the queen, whoever she is, wherever she came from, whatever scar she carries on her collarbone. You do not, because the king's justice is a patient thing, and patient things are the most dangerous. It was not kindness. It was not romance. It was governance. And Lena respected governance because governance was a system, and systems she could learn. She spent the next week learning. The Lycan court operated on 3 levels. The visible level was politics, meetings, councils, territorial disputes, trade agreements. Alpha representatives from packs across the country came and went, seeking rulings, requesting resources, filing complaints. The court heard them all with the bureaucratic patience of an institution that had existed for centuries and fully intended to exist for centuries more. The second level was military. The court maintained its own force, separate from any pack, trained fighters, scouts, intelligence operatives. They answered to Cale directly, and they were the reason every alpha on the continent spoke the Lycan king's name with a particular careful respect, the way you speak about a storm you cannot see but know is there. The third level was the one Lena had stumbled into, the noble houses, ancient Lycan families who had circled the throne for generations, marrying their children into power, building alliances and grudges with equal dedication, playing a game that had been running so long the original rules had been forgotten and replaced with something that looked like tradition but was really just inertia. 3 houses had been competing for the queen's seat. The Harlans, old military money with a daughter named Claire, who had the face of a painting and the personality of a closed fist. The Ashfords, trade barons with connections to every pack east of the mountains. And the Devane family, who were quieter than the other 2, and therefore, Lena suspected, more dangerous. All 3 houses had spent years positioning. All 3 had expected Cale to choose from their offerings, the way kings had always chosen. a political marriage, an alliance sealed in bed linen and ceremony. Instead, he had married an Omega's orphan with a bond scar and a borrowed pen. The houses were furious. They hid it well, but not well enough. Not from someone who had grown up reading Rooms for Survival. Lena could feel their anger in the pauses that lasted a beat too long when she entered a room, in the way conversations rearranged themselves around her presence, in the careful, calibrated politeness that was worse than open hostility because it left no handhold to grip. She ate meals alone. She walked the corridors alone. She attended the council meetings that Marcus told her she was permitted to attend, and she sat in the back and listened, and learned the names and the alliances and the debts and the grudges. She learned fast. This was a skill she had. The ability to enter a room full of people who did not want her there, and map the power structure before anyone noticed she was paying attention. At Blackmere, she had used it to stay safe. Here she used it to understand. The first formal dinner happened on her 10th night. A long table in a hall lit by fixtures that cast amber light across stone walls. 30 seats. The noble houses, senior military officers, council members, and Cale at the head, with an empty chair beside him that everyone understood was hers. She sat in it. Vanessa Grant's face flashed through her mind. White dress, blonde hair, the Luna's seat. This was not the Luna's seat. This was the Queen's seat, and the Queen of the Lycan court was not selected by an alpha at a ceremony. The Queen of the Lycan court sat at the left hand of the king and ate dinner with people who wanted her gone, and she did it with her spine straight and her hands steady, and claw marks still healing under her shirt. The wine came in crystal glasses. Lena did not drink. She never drank at events where she did not control the room, and she had not controlled a room since she was old enough to understand what control meant. The food was excellent. She ate it with the focused attention of someone who had recently gone 2 days without a real meal and was not going to waste a single bite on conversation. Lady Priscilla Devane sat across from her, elegant in the way that old money is elegant, with silver hair and a face that had been sharpened by decades of getting what she wanted. She smiled at Lena, with lips that did not match her eyes, and asked, in a voice that carried the perfect pitch of polite curiosity, how Lena was finding the court. Lena said, "Big." Lady Priscilla's smile tightened 1 degree. She asked if Lena had settled into her new role. Lena said, "I have settled into my room. The role was not part of the agreement." Lord Harlan, 3 seats down, laughed. Short and dry, the sound of a man who had found something funny and was deciding whether to use it. Cale said nothing. He ate his dinner with the calm, methodical focus of someone who was listening to everything and responding to none of it, and his eyes moved across the table the way a chess player's eyes move across a board, taking inventory, calculating. The dinner proceeded without incident until the 4th course, when Lena lifted her wine glass to take a sip of water she had poured into it instead, and a scent hit her that made her wolf lurch forward so hard she almost shifted at the table. Wolfsbane. In the wine. Not enough to kill, enough to incapacitate. She put the glass down. She looked at the table. 30 faces, some watching her, most pretending not to. The wolfsbane was faint enough that most wolves would not have caught it, but Lena was an Omega's daughter, and Omegas carried a sensitivity to toxins that stronger wolves did not possess, a genetic leftover from centuries of being the pack's canaries in the mine. Her mother had been a canary. Look how that ended. She pushed the glass to the center of the table, in front of the centerpiece, where it sat like an accusation. She did not say a word. She finished her dinner. She complimented the chef. She excused herself with the measured politeness of someone who was going to scream into a pillow the moment she was behind a closed door. Cale found her in the corridor. Not immediately. He waited until the dinner ended, until the nobles dispersed, until the hallway was empty, and their conversation would not be overheard. He appeared beside her the way he always appeared, without warning and without noise, like a man who had learned to move through spaces without disturbing them. He said, "The glass has been taken for analysis." She said, "I know what was in it." He said, "I know you know." They stood in the corridor in the amber light and the silence, and Cale looked at her with an expression that was not pity, and was not anger, and was not anything she had a word for. It was the expression of a man who was watching someone do exactly what he had hoped they would do, and was not surprised, and was not pleased, but was something adjacent to both. He said, "You handled it correctly." She said, "I handled it the only way I could. I do not have the power to handle it any other way." He said, "You will." She looked at him, searched his face for the lie, the manipulation, the angle. She had been looking for the angle since the gas station, waiting for the moment when the bill would come due and the stranger's kindness would reveal its price tag. She found nothing. Either he was a better liar than anyone she had ever met, or he was telling the truth. Both options were terrifying. She went to her room. She locked the door. She sat on the bed and pressed the Bon Salve jar against her collarbone and thought about wine glasses and stone arenas, and a king who removed threats in silence and offered herbs without notes, and looked at her like she was a variable he had not yet solved. The next morning, the Ashford family's trade agreements were revoked. 3 of them, major ones, the kind that funded estates and maintained influence and kept a noble house in the orbit of power. No announcement, no public hearing, just a quiet administrative action processed through the court's bureaucracy like a routine matter. Lord Ashford came to the council meeting that afternoon with the contained rage of a man who had been hit in a place he could not defend. He did not look at Lena. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood the connection. You do not poison the Queen's glass. The message was delivered in a language the noble houses understood far better than words. Money, access, position. The currency of the court was not blood, it was leverage, and Cale wielded it with the precise, devastating efficiency of someone who had been doing this his entire life. Lena watched Lord Ashford's composure crack and repair itself in real time, and she learned something about the Lycan king that no one had told her, and she would not have believed if they had. He was not cruel. Cruelty was wasteful. He was exact. And exactness, in a court of wolves who had been playing power games for centuries, was far more frightening than cruelty could ever be. She started attending every council meeting, not in the back, in the chair beside Cale, the Queen's chair. She did not speak during the first 3 meetings. She listened. She watched. She mapped the room the way she had always mapped rooms, tracking who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who held their breath when certain topics arose. On the 4th meeting, a territorial dispute between 2 packs in the south, she spoke. She said one sentence. A question, actually. She asked why the disputed territory's water rights had been excluded from the negotiation, when the water was the only thing either pack actually wanted. The room went quiet. Both pack representatives looked at her, then at each other, then at the maps spread across the table, where the water routes were clearly marked and clearly absent from the terms being discussed. The dispute was resolved in 40 minutes. It had been running for 2 years. Cale did not comment. He moved to the next agenda item with the same calm, methodical focus he applied to everything. But Marcus, standing at the back of the room, caught Lena's eye and gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen a human head produce. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not the Bond scar, something else. Something that felt like the first warm day after a long winter, where the ground is still frozen but the air is starting to remember what heat is. She had not felt useful in a very long time. She had forgotten how much she needed it. That night, for the first time, Lena did not eat dinner alone. Marcus sat across from her and ate in silence, which was apparently his preferred mode of human interaction, and a young wolf named Sophie, who worked in the court's archives, sat beside her and talked enough for all 3 of them about the history of the compound and the genealogy of the noble houses and the time Lord Harlan's daughter Claire had tried to ride a horse inside the Great Hall, and the horse had opinions about it. Lena laughed. She had not laughed in weeks. The sound came out rusty and strange, like a machine that had been sitting idle and was coughing back to life. Sophie looked delighted, Marcus looked like he might be experiencing an emotion, but was not yet ready to commit to identifying it. Lena went to bed that night and lay in the dark, and listened to the mountains and felt the bond scar sitting quiet against her collarbone. It had not hurt in 4 days. She did not know what that meant. She was not ready to find out. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with black wax and the Blackmere crest stamped into it like a bruise. Lena recognized the seal before she recognized the handwriting, and her stomach dropped so fast she felt it hit the floor of her ribcage. She stood in her room holding the envelope, and the bond scar on her collarbone flared awake for the first time in weeks, a dull, low throb that felt less like pain and more like a warning. She opened it. Dominic's handwriting was neat, controlled, the handwriting of a man who had been raised to lead and had never considered the possibility that he might not be good at it. He was coming to the Lycan court, diplomatic visit. He had matters to discuss with the king. He requested an audience. He requested it formally, using the language of pack politics and territorial protocol, and nowhere in the letter did he mention Lena by name. But they both knew why he was coming. Word had reached Blackmere. Of course it had. The rejected Omega who fled in a 14-year-old sedan had married the most powerful wolf alive. The woman Dominic had publicly discarded was sitting in the Queen's chair at the Lycan court, and every dismissal, every slight, every whispered poor thing was now a direct insult to the obsidian throne. Lena put the letter down. She picked it up again. She put it down. She put it down. She picked up the bonsav jar instead and pressed it against her collarbone and breathed in the herbs and waited for the scar to settle. But it did not settle. It just sat there humming like a wire that someone had plucked, and she could feel Dominic at the other end of it, distant, getting closer. She found Cale in his office, a room on the top floor of the central building that was smaller than she expected and filled with more books than furniture. He was reading something and did not look up when she entered, which she had learned was not rudeness but simply the way he operated. He registered presences the way a radar registers aircraft. He knew she was there. He would engage when the information required it. She put the letter on his desk. He read it. His face did not change. Nothing about his body language shifted or tightened or gave any indication that the letter contained anything more significant than a weather report. He said, "He will arrive in 3 days." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you want me to deny the visit?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Lena looked at it. She could say yes. She could say deny it, refuse entry, send him back to Blackmere with nothing. The king's authority was absolute. No alpha entered the court without permission. She said no. Cale looked at her then, actually looked, the way he had looked at her at the gas station, with that focused, calculating attention that felt less like being seen and more like being read. She said, "If I hide from him, I am still the woman he threw away. If I face him, I am something else." Cale nodded once and went back to his reading. The 3 days passed the way all dreaded days pass, too slowly and too fast at the same time. Lena attended council meetings. She ate meals with Marcus and Sophie. She walked the corridors of the compound and felt the whispers follow her like weather, different now than they had been when she first arrived. The court had started to adjust to her presence the way a body adjusts to a transplant. Not acceptance, not yet, but the active rejection was fading. The noble houses still watched her with the guarded hostility of people protecting territory, but the attacks had stopped. No more rigged sparring sessions. No more poisoned wine. Cale's quiet, methodical dismantling of the Ashford trade agreements had sent a message that the other houses had received clearly. Lena had sent her own message, the water rights dispute, the council meetings, the way she sat in the Queen's chair and listened and mapped and then spoke, rarely and precisely, and was right often enough that even Lord Harlan had started looking at her with something that was not exactly respect but was in the same neighborhood. Dominic arrived on a Friday morning. He came with an entourage, 6 wolves, dressed in Blackmere formal wear, carrying the practiced confidence of a pack that believed it was more important than it was. And Vanessa. He brought Vanessa. His Luna, the woman he had chosen over a mate bond. She wore white again. Lena watched them enter the great hall from the gallery above, looking down through the stone railing at the procession below. She could see the top of Dominic's head, the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he moved through space with the easy, territorial authority of an alpha in his prime. Her wolf did nothing. A month ago, the sight of him would have sent the Bond Scar screaming. Now her wolf looked down at Dominic Hale and felt nothing but the distant echo of a frequency she had already stopped tuning into. She went downstairs. The formal reception was held in the council chamber. Cale sat at the head of the table in the obsidian chair that served as a throne when a throne was needed, and Lena sat beside him, and Dominic sat across from them, with Vanessa at his side and his 6 wolves arranged behind him like a wall he was hiding behind. He looked at Lena. She watched it happen. The moment his eyes found the Bond Scar on her collarbone and tracked upward to her face, and registered that the woman sitting in the Queen's chair was the same woman he had knocked off a dais 4 weeks ago. She watched the calculation run behind his eyes, the rapid recalibration of a man who had made a bet and was just now beginning to understand how badly it had gone. He did not look away. She gave him credit for that. He held her gaze and his jaw worked once, a small involuntary clench, and then his face smoothed into the diplomatic mask he had been trained to wear. He addressed Cale, spoke about cooperation between Blackmere and the court, used words like alliance and mutual benefit and shared prosperity, the language of politics, polished and hollow, designed to fill space without committing to anything. Cale listened, said nothing. Let Dominic fill the silence with words that meant less the longer he spoke. Vanessa sat beside Dominic and said nothing. She looked at Lena once, briefly, and her expression was complicated. Not triumph, not hostility, something that lived in the space between pity and recognition, as if she understood that the chair she had won came with a receipt, and the receipt was standing on a dais in her memory, bleeding from the palms. The formal meeting ended. Cale granted Dominic 48 hours of diplomatic access, which was standard and sufficient, and contained the unspoken message that 48 hours was all the patience the Lycan king intended to spend on the Blackmere pack. Dominic requested a private meeting with Lena. The room went still. Marcus, standing behind Cale, shifted his weight the way a weapon shifts on a shelf when someone walks too close to it. The Blackmere wolves stiffened. Vanessa's hands folded in her lap. Cale looked at Lena. Not for permission, not for instruction. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when he asked if she wanted to deny the visit. The decision is yours. She said yes. The private meeting was held in a small room off the council chamber. Stone walls, a table, 2 chairs, no witnesses. Marcus stationed himself outside the door and did not pretend he was not listening through 3 inches of stone. Dominic sat across from her and did not speak for a long time. When he did not apologize. She had known he would not. Dominic Hale had never apologized for anything in his life because he had been raised in a system that taught him his decisions were correct, by definition, because he was the one making them. He explained. That was what he did. He told her she had to understand. The pack needed Vanessa's money, the Grant family's land, their resources, their connections. The Blackmere pack was struggling. Debts, territory disputes, the cost of maintaining a pack in a changing world. Vanessa's dowry could fund the pack for a decade. Her father's land secured their borders. Lena was an orphan, an Omega's daughter. She brought nothing to the table but a bond that the universe had assigned without consulting the spreadsheets. He said it was not personal. She let him finish. She sat in the stone room and let every word land and register and pass through her, and she did not interrupt, and she did not argue, and she did not cry, because she had cried for Dominic Hale in a parking lot and on a courtyard floor and in a too-big room in the mountains, and she had used up every tear she was willing to give him. When he was done, she said, "I understand." He blinked. She said, "I understood then, I understand now. You made a choice based on money and power and the survival of your pack. I have never blamed you for the choice." She leaned forward. She said, "I blame you because you were not sorry." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. Dominic's face changed. Not a mask this time. Something real. Something that cracked through the surface for half a second before he caught it and smoothed it over. But not fast enough. She saw it. She saw the flicker of recognition. The moment when he heard her words and understood them and knew they were true and did not know what to do with that knowledge. He had not been sorry. He had been strategic. He had been calculating. He had been practical and responsible, and every other word that alphas use to describe the choices they make with other people's lives. But he had not been sorry. She stood up. She walked out. Marcus fell into step beside her in the corridor and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done at that moment. Dominic stood alone in the stone room for a long time. 2 days later, Cale presented evidence to the Lycan court. Financial records, territory transactions, communications, a dossier that had been assembled over months with the patient, meticulous care of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. Blackmere's finances were not just struggling, they were corrupt. Embezzlement on a scale that implicated half the pack's leadership, illegal territory trades that violated court law, and the Grant family fortune, Vanessa's dowry, the money that Dominic had sold his mate bond for, was built on labor exploitation. Omega wolves in work camps on Grant territory, unpaid, undocumented, invisible. The same system that had crushed Lena's parents. The same invisibility that had made her disposable. Vanessa's father was arrested by court security before sundown. The Grant family assets were frozen. The Blackmere pack was placed under Lycan court oversight, its autonomy suspended pending investigation. Dominic did not lose his alpha title. Cale left him that. Left him just enough power to sit in his pack house and watch the consequences arrive one by one, like waves from a stone dropped in water a very long time ago. Lena watched the proceedings from the Queen's chair and felt nothing that she could name. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not the cathartic release that stories promise when the villain receives their punishment. She felt tired. She felt the bond scar sit quiet against her collarbone, and she felt the weight of a system that had been grinding Omegas into dust for longer than anyone could remember, and she felt tired in the way you feel tired when you realize the fight is bigger than the people in the room. Dominic left the court on a Sunday morning. She did not watch him go. She had more important things to do. 6 months into the contract marriage, Cale placed a folder on the table between them during a strategy meeting and said nothing. Lena was mid-sentence. She had been talking about the Omega protection proposal she had been building for 3 weeks. A comprehensive mandate that would establish legal rights, housing standards, and educational access for Omega wolves across every territory under court jurisdiction. She had spreadsheets. She had precedent cases. She had a 30-page brief that she had written in the archive library at 2 in the morning while Sophie slept on a pile of history books beside her, and Marcus stood guard outside the door, pretending he was not standing guard outside the door. She stopped talking. She looked at the folder. Cale pushed it across the table with one finger. She opened it. Dissolution papers. Neatly printed. Legally formatted. The contract marriage agreement, with its 12-month term and its exit clauses and its carefully negotiated conditions, had been drafted for early termination, 6 months ahead of schedule. All obligations fulfilled, all terms met. She was free to go. The room was empty except for the two of them. Afternoon light came through the narrow windows and laid stripes across the stone floor and the table and the dissolution papers in Cale's hands, which were folded in front of him with the composed stillness of a man who was not nervous, because he had trained himself out of nervousness the way you train yourself out of a bad habit. He said the agreement was for 1 year. I am offering early termination. She stared at the papers. He said, you will receive full territorial rights. Resources to establish your own settlement, pack status, if you want it, legal autonomy, everything we discussed. She turned a page. The legal language blurred. He said, you owe me nothing. She looked at him. He was doing the thing he always did, the controlled stillness, the face that gave nothing away, the voice calibrated to the exact pitch of calm authority that made everyone in the court listen without knowing they were listening. He was the Lycan King. He had been the Lycan King since before she met him, and he would be the Lycan King long after she was gone, and the stone compound and the council chamber and the obsidian throne would go on without her, the way they had gone on before her. She thought about the gas station, the coffee on the roof of her car, the card under the windshield wiper, the quiet, unexplained patience of a man who had stood in a parking lot at dawn holding a paper cup for a stranger who had told him where to put it. She thought about the Bond salve on her nightstand, the first jar and the ones that came after, a new one every 2 weeks, always without a note, always there when she woke up as if the compound itself was producing them. She thought about the training session, Petra's claws on her ribs, the way Kale had not intervened, had let her stand or fall on her own terms, and then had removed the threat in silence. Not protection, respect. The difference between shielding someone from a fire and handing them the extinguisher. She thought about the wine glass, the Ashford trade agreements, the way he wielded power like a surgical instrument, cutting exactly what needed cutting and leaving everything else intact. The way he sat in council meetings and listened to her speak and argued with her when she was wrong and agreed with her when she was right, and treated her opinions like real objects that existed in the world and could be weighed and measured and taken seriously. Nobody had ever argued with her before. Not really. At Blackmere, people had ignored her, or tolerated her, or talked over her, but nobody had ever engaged with her ideas as if they mattered enough to be wrong about. Kale did. He pushed back on her proposals with the focused intensity of a man who expected her to defend them, and when she did, when she found the flaw in his argument before he found the flaw in hers, something happened in his face that was not quite a smile but lived in the same zip code. She thought about the way he stood close to her in corridors and meetings and doorways, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the presence, the solid, immovable fact of a man who took up space without apology, close enough that closing the distance would have been easy. She had not closed it. He had not asked her to. After the flinch, the first time he had touched her shoulder during a strategy meeting and she had recoiled so hard she knocked a crystal decanter off the table, and the room went silent, and the Bond scar screamed, and 5 years of a particular kind of history came flooding back. He had pulled his hand away and held it in the air for a moment and then put it in his pocket and never touched her again. Not because he did not want to. She was not stupid. She had seen the way his eyes tracked her when she entered a room, the slight tension in his jaw when she stood close, the careful, deliberate distance he maintained at all times, as if proximity was a live wire and he was the one who would get burned. He did not touch her because she had flinched, and the flinch had told him everything he needed to know, and he had decided, without discussion, without negotiation, without making it about himself, that the next move was hers. He was still waiting. 6 months of waiting. 6 months of herbs on nightstands and arguments in council meetings and quiet displays of power that never required her gratitude. 6 months of a man who looked at her like she was a puzzle he was in no hurry to solve because the solving was not the point. The point was that she existed in the room with him, and the room was better for it. She looked at the dissolution papers. She looked at Kale. The Bond scar on her collarbone had stopped hurting 3 months ago. She had not told anyone. She had not examined it too closely, because examining it meant asking why, and asking why meant following a thread that led somewhere she was not sure she was ready to go. A severed mate bond is supposed to hurt forever. That is what the old wolves say. The pain fades, but it never leaves. It sits in the bone like a splinter, a permanent reminder that you were made for someone, and that someone chose differently. Lena's had gone quiet. Not numb, not suppressed, quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone you trust walks in. The way a dog stops barking when it recognizes the footsteps on the porch. She did not sign the papers. She closed the folder. She said no. Kale's composure held. It always held. But something behind his eyes moved, something fast and bright and immediately contained, like a match struck in a dark room and then cupped in a hand before the wind could find it. He said, "You are not obligated to stay." She said, "I know." He said, "The terms of the agreement have been fulfilled. You have no debt." She said, "I know." He said, "Nothing else." She picked up the folder and stood up and walked out of the room with the dissolution papers under her arm, and her spine straight and her chin up, and the bond scar sitting silent on her collarbone like a sleeping thing. She went to her room. She sat on the bed, the same bed she had sat on 6 months ago when she arrived with one bag and a broken bond and nothing else. The room looked different now. Books on the nightstand, notes pinned to the wall above the desk, the bond salve jar, nearly empty, sitting beside a stack of policy briefs and a half-eaten apple. She had built a life in this room, a small one, a careful one, a life assembled from council meetings and archive research and dinners with Marcus and Sophie, and the slow, stubborn process of turning a hostile court into something that could tolerate her presence. She had not planned to build a life here. She had planned to survive. Surviving had turned into something else when she was not paying attention. The next morning was a full council session. Trade agreements, territorial adjustments, a dispute between 3 packs in the West that had been escalating for months. Lena walked into the council chamber at 8 in the morning with her Omega protection mandate under one arm and the dissolution papers folded in her back pocket and a cup of the good coffee in her hand. The room was full, noble house representatives, military officers, pack delegates, Marcus at his post by the door, Sophie in the back, ostensibly taking notes, actually drawing portraits of Lord Harlan in the margins. Cale sat in the obsidian chair. He looked at Lena when she entered, a glance so brief and controlled that no one in the room would have noticed it unless they were looking for it. She was looking for it. She sat in the Queen's chair. She did not speak during the first 2 agenda items. She listened. She mapped the room. She noted who was allied with whom today, who had shifted positions since last week, who was carrying new information, and who was bluffing. When the 3rd item came up, the Western territorial dispute, she leaned forward. She did not talk about the territory. She talked about the Omegas. She laid the mandate on the table, 30 pages of policy and precedent, and the kind of careful, evidence-based argument that is very difficult to dismiss when it is right. She talked about labor camps, about the Grant family's operations and the Blackmere investigations and the pattern, stretching back decades, of Omega wolves being used as expendable labor in territories that claimed they did not exist. She talked about her parents. One sentence. She said, "My parents worked in a camp like this, and they did not survive it." She moved on. The room shifted, not physically, somewhere deeper, the way a room shifts when someone says a true thing that has been sitting under the surface for years, and the surface cannot hold it anymore. Lord Harlan leaned back in his chair. Lady Priscilla folded her hands. The Ashford representative, a young wolf who had replaced his family's disgraced elder, looked at Lena with an expression she had never seen from a noble house member. Interest. Lena presented the mandate point by point. Housing standards, educational access, legal representation, medical care, a court-enforced registry of Omega workers across all territories, with protections against exploitation and accountability measures for alphas who violated the terms. It was comprehensive. It was specific. It was the product of 3 weeks of research and 3 months of learning how the court operated and 23 years of knowing what it felt like to be invisible in a system that was designed to keep you that way. She finished. The room was quiet. Cale spoke first. He asked a question about enforcement logistics, a real question with real substance, the kind of question that treated the proposal as a serious piece of governance and not a symbolic gesture from the token Omega in the Queen's chair. She answered it. He asked another. She answered that too. The debate lasted 4 hours. Not everyone agreed. The noble houses pushed back on jurisdiction, on cost, on the disruption to existing labor agreements that their families had profited from for generations. Lord Harlan argued precedent. Lady Priscilla argued economics. Lena argued back. She argued with the controlled intensity of someone who had spent her entire life being told she did not matter, and had decided, somewhere between a parking lot and a throne, that she was done agreeing with them. The mandate passed. Not unanimously, but it passed, by a margin wide enough that it could not be dismissed as a courtesy vote or a political favor. The first official act of the Lycan Queen. The chamber emptied slowly. Wolves filed out, talking in low voices, processing the shift that had just occurred beneath their feet. The noble houses withdrew with the measured dignity of people who had lost a battle and were already planning for the next one. Marcus nodded at Lena as he passed, and the nod contained more approval than most people's standing ovations. Sophie hugged her in the corridor and whispered that Lord Harlan's left eye had been twitching for the last 40 minutes, and she had drawn 7 pictures of it and would Lena like to see them. Lena said yes. She went to Cale's office that night. Late. The compound was quiet, the corridors empty, the mountain air cold against the windows. His light was on, which meant he was reading, which meant he was always reading, because Cale processed the world through information the way other people processed it through conversation. She knocked once and entered without waiting for a response, because she had learned that waiting for responses from the Lycan King was a luxury with diminishing returns. He looked up. She put the dissolution papers on his desk, folded into a neat square. She had written on the back in pen, the same borrowed pen handwriting she had used to sign their marriage certificate in a nothing courthouse in a nothing town 6 months ago. 4 words. I am staying. Your move. Cale looked at the papers. He read the words. He turned the square over and looked at it again, as if checking for additional instructions, and then he set it down on his desk, beside his reading and his coffee and the stack of intelligence reports he had been reviewing. He looked at her. She stood in his doorway with her arms crossed and her chin up, and her bond scar sitting silent on her collarbone, and her eyes steady and clear, and carrying something that was not a declaration and not a question, but something in between that did not have a name, because names are for things that have been finished, and this was just beginning. He smiled. Not the controlled, political smile he used in council meetings, not the almost smile he deployed in rare moments of dry amusement. A real one. It broke across his face like a crack in stone, unexpected and slightly uneven, and completely human, and it changed his features so dramatically that Lena understood, in a rush, that she had never actually seen him smile before. She had seen the performance, the management, the mask. This was the man underneath it. He did not say a word. He picked up the folded papers and put them in his desk drawer, and closed it, and the click of the drawer was the quietest sound she had ever heard and the loudest thing that had happened between them in 6 months. He stood up. He did not move toward her. He stood behind his desk in the lamplight with his hands at his sides and his face open for the first time since she had known him, and he waited. He was always waiting. But this time the wait had a different quality to it, not patience, anticipation, the focused, bright-eyed energy of a man who had just received an answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. Lena uncrossed her arms. She did not close the distance. Not tonight. Tonight she stood in the doorway and looked at him and let the silence hold everything they were not saying and felt the bond scar sit warm against her collarbone, not hurting, not aching, just warm, like a hand pressed flat against her skin. She said, "Good night, Cale." He said, "Good night, Lena." She walked back to her room through the empty corridors, with the mountain air cold on her skin and the stars pressing close above the compound, and something expanding in her chest that felt enormous and terrifying and new. She was not the woman who had fled Blackmere in a cracked sedan with $300 and a shattered bond. She was not the Omega's orphan, the charity case, the poor thing whispered about in hallways. She was not the woman Dominic Hale had thrown away on a dais in front of 400 wolves. She was the woman who had stood up, who had kept standing, who had walked into a court full of wolves that wanted her gone, and had refused to leave until the court changed around her. She was the Lycan queen. Not because a king had chosen her, kings had chosen her before, and it had broken her, because she had chosen herself, and that, she was beginning to understand, was the only choice that had ever mattered. She slept that night in the too big bed, in the too big room, in the compound in the mountains, and the Bon Salve jar sat on her nightstand beside her policy briefs and Sophie's drawings and the half-eaten apple, and the Bon scar on her collarbone was warm and quiet and still. In his office, Cale sat at his desk with the drawer closed and the folded papers inside it and the lamp burning low, and he did not read, and he did not work, and he did not plan. He sat in the quiet and he thought about a woman in a parking lot who had told him where to put his coffee, and he thought about the sound of her voice in the council chamber, and he thought about the 4 words written in borrowed pen handwriting on the back of a document he had never wanted her to sign. "I am staying. Your move." For the first time in his reign, the Lycan king did not know what came next. The strange thing was, he did not mind. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark and listened to the mountains, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the world contained more possibilities than he had accounted for. Outside, the stars turned above the compound, and the wolves slept, and the stone walls held their heat, and the corridor between his office and her room stretched empty and waiting, a distance that was neither short nor long, but exactly the length of a decision that had not yet been made. It would be made. Not tonight, not in a rush or a sweep of dramatic revelation. It would be made the way everything between them had been made, in silence and in patience, and in the small, accumulating weight of 2 people who had learned to trust each other by never demanding trust. The distance would close. But that was a story for another day, and this one was finished, and the mountains held their breath, and the night was deep and full of possibility, and somewhere in the compound the Lycan queen slept in a bed that had become hers and dreamed of nothing, which was the first true rest she had known since before the dais and the ceremony and the 400 wolves who had watched her fall. She did not dream of falling any more. She dreamed of standing, and when she woke in the morning, she did.